What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. You can also call me Delks Moses. I anoint myself with grease. I'm governed by caprice. The white man is the devil and the black man is God. Snow bunnies never, black queens forever, all that good stuff. You know how we rocking, man. And yes, this is our 11th book in our Book to React series. This is Marlon B. Ross's Sissy Insurgencies, A Racial Anatomy of Unfit Manliness. This is our first book that was requested by one of the followers, DoorOfEl. Shout out to him, and shout out to everybody else who's going to tune into this live stream chat as we continue to read this fascinating, very academic, very dense book. My first book really covering masculinity studies, Black masculinity studies. I find this very fascinating. It's a lot to take in. It's given me a lot to think about over the past few days since we've started this book. This is our third book. I know in the title it says 2, but it's actually number 3. So shout out to everybody who's going to tune in for the third part, and I suggest you go watch parts 1 and 2 before then. So as we said, this book was written by this fellow here, Marlon B. Ross. This is the fellow right here, and you can pick up this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $30 paperback and $37 hardcover. Get it while it's still hot on the presses. And yeah, in our last reading of this book, we were examining Richard Wright's book, Black Boy, which I have here on my library shelf, but I haven't had a chance to crack it open yet, and also some other text as well. And he was negotiating how masculinity for black men is something that is very, how can I say this, dynamic, in the sense that we as black men are not able to be full men in a white supremacist society because, our masculinity is negotiated with how we interact with the white male power structure. He was talking about how in Richard Wright's book, one of the characters there allowed a white man to kick him in the ass and pop a quarter in his mouth, right? And there was an interpretation that could be brought there of, black men willingly allowing white men to penetrate them and stuff like that. So it got kind of really deep. And then also we read the section on Sissy Liminality, meaning, the limits of what masculinity is for black men, and also examining how, sissydom or a femininity for black men can be negotiated and expressed. It got very deep. It's just better to watch part 2 rather than going through all of this, because this is a very deep and philosophical book, and I'm trying to struggle with it live in front of y'all. So I want everybody to know, first and foremost, it takes a lot of, number one, time and effort to do this type of work, reading books for the people live on stream. But also it takes a lot of courage for me to admit, my ignorance when I'm dealing with a text that's very hard to wrap your mind around, and really trying to struggle with the concepts in it, right? Because it's still very foreign to me, and that's the reason why we do these live streams, is to show that we should have an open mind for these things. So without further ado, let's get into our new sections today. We're going to be reading 2 parts, the Sissy Race Card and the other one that will be coming up. I forgot, but it's in the it's in the description of this video, and so you'll see what we're going to be talking about. So let's get into it. My teachers, classmates, and team members seemed to embrace me as though I were a normally gendered boy, and I speculate that it was perhaps my decent athleticism that shielded them from my sissiness, or rather shielded me from their suspicions. There is another possibility, however. In hindsight, it is highly likely that in the era of legally forced desegregation, my race veiled my sissiness from others, both black and white, in different ways. I was certainly not the only too-good black boy in my class. There was a gaggle of us, other black middle-class aspiring middle school boys who performed well academically and athletically. Were any of them also hiding their sissy temperaments behind others' racial assumptions? The further past puberty we got, however, the thinner our numbers became. Sports, bands, partying girls began to consume more of their time as we progressed through high school, whereas my time was spent increasingly proving something to someone, or overcompensating for something I could not fully comprehend about myself. The further we got past puberty, the more pronounced a flagrant sissy gender anomalousness became, and that sissiness tended increasingly toward what others identified as effeminacy: limp hand gestures, swishing behinds, skipping gaits, girlish giggling, voices that trailed upward in pitch at the end of sentences. Puberty is supposed to deepen the gulf between boy and girl based in an ideology of bodily consent. Ironically, as homosexuality has become increasingly a legally protected category, the equation of sissiness with homosexuality has been able to offer a sort of shield for gender anomalous conduct insofar as it provides a social rationale for sissy behavior. Far too self-conscious of my physical comportment, I guarded mightily against effeminate mannerisms, although it was not always easy to see how I appeared to others, or to know exactly what counted as unboyish in a desegregating school system. In high school, one of my white male classmates, one of my football teammates, casually observed that I carried my books like a girl, hugging them up close to my chest rather than wielding them low at my side. It only took one offhand comment. Though offhand, so to speak, the comment itself highlights how closely surveilled a boy's demeanor is, not only to a school principal but also to other boys and girls. Because appropriate gender conduct within the masculine is so fugitive, hard to pin down, its informal rules are especially draconian, subject to punishment on the slightest misprision. Carrying my books close to the chest seemed convenient. Carrying my books close to the chest seemed convenient and thus natural, perhaps even visceral to me, especially given my penchant for toting around so many books at once before the popularity of the backpack. In fact, the boyish way of carrying books, swinging them in the hand at the side as though a weapon in waiting, seems in retrospect to indicate that no boy should carry so many books as to need to hug them at the chest. Once this habit of book carrying was mentioned to me, however, I recognized how even such a slight gesture harbored the potential for gender shaming. I could easily, if self-consciously, change my book carrying conduct, but I could not diminish the very self-consciousness that caused my sense of doubt about my masculine fitness. What had been an unconscious habit all of a sudden became a calculated performance that defined my chastened conduct, as I sought to remember the proper book-carrying form. For sure, race clouds the question of how boys and men are perceived socially in regard to masculine conformity, as Neil has so brilliantly articulated through his concept of illegibility. While racial gender stereotyping projects onto black maleness some attributes as overly legible, it necessarily also projects other attributes as illegible. If black boys are supposed to be cool to the point of over phallic hardness, what does it mean when a black boy carries his books like a girl, or not enough like a boy? Might this be an effect of inhabiting a different racial culture in a Jim Crow school? I remember my first college roommate, a white boy from a neighboring town who met me during summer orientation, went through the trouble of finding out my home phone number, and insisted on arranging for us to be roommates. He seemed nice enough, if a tad bit too eager, and after rooming with him for a couple of months, I realized what the problem was. He thought he had found in me an approachable black boy who could make him more cool without his feeling intimidated by my black masculinity. Let's call this expectation the Booker T syndrome. I was deemed enough of a non-intimidating Negro to serve as his bridge to blackness because I did not seem the rough, hyper-masculine N-word who haunts and titillates the fantasies of so many whites. One night, when I innocuously walked into the room, my new roommate expressed a sudden delighted admiration for how I walked and begged me to teach him to walk black. When I laughingly reported that, unfortunately, I had miserably failed at conquering that particular skill, he refused to accept the idea, saying that I naturally walked that way and that he could see me dipping and dapping like the college black basketball players. Almost all the black males at my college were basketball players. When I came into the room, basically, this white male roommate is somehow fetishizing him to some degree. All right, needless to say, I had to abandon him as a roommate. For a white young man who had chosen to room with me because of my black maleness, not even my too good sissy conduct could clue him in, even though it could make me attractive to him as an experimental project to overcome his racial fears and live out his fantasies of cool cross-racial camaraderie. Although there has been some good scholarship indicating how same gender sexuality takes on diverse forms across different nationalities and cultures, there has been very little consideration of the implications of cultural difference for sissiness and sissyphobia. I have elsewhere discussed how historically in black literature and popular culture, there has been a bifurcation of the sissy into swishing versus respectable figures. In Sissies at the Picnic, Ferguson observes a similar categorization at work in the black communities of his rural Georgia hometown during the 1970s. The sissies that I knew ran the gamut of gender styles. Some, like Edward, were limp-wristed and sashayed as they walked. Others, like my literature instructor, were straight-laced and masculine. Still others, like the pianist and choir directors, had a fondness for perms and relaxers. This reminds me of my two very formative teachers in elementary school. I was lucky enough to have two black men be my elementary school teachers. Mr. Naylor, who was the traditional masculine man, thick-necked, very muscular, liked rap and hip-hop and often alluded to his past with women, right? And then I had Mr. January. Mr. January, tall, lanky figure man, presented as masculine and heterosexual because he often talked about his large family. I think he had 4 kids, and now he's up to like 7 now or something last time I heard. And Mr. January came across as more effeminate, right? And I had those two dynamics in my mind when thinking about black malehood. Of course, I had like my father at my home as well, who presented another type of black malehood. Mr. January and Mr. Naylor, for me, really exemplify this dynamic of like the dandy, the sissy, and the traditional masculine man. And as far as I know, Mr. Naylor and Mr. January got along very, very well. So continuing here. Although Ferguson does tend to equate sissiness fully with homosexuality in his essay, he is one of the few cultural theorists who has helped to articulate the heterogeneous figurations of sissy conduct available within black communities, clarifying the imports of this observation for queer theory more generally. Ferguson explains how the social realities of black sissiness are easily obscured and overlooked within the narratives and theories developed to explain the emergence of modern homosexuality in the West. There is a history jeopardized by prevalent understandings of queer identities and tired notions about black communities, images discarded by hegemonic formations as trifling and unimportant. Since the hegemonic narrative of modern homosexuality is figured around cosmopolitanism, whiteness, normative gender practices, the narrative can only approach a discrepant history like mine by suppressing it. I will tell this tale as a way to illuminate the heterogeneous makeup of the black communities that I knew in West Central Georgia, a configuration that confused the precincts of past and present man and woman, heterosexual and queer, often reduced to a uniform stereotype in mass media and pushed under the radar of queer theory. This array of black sissy conduct, from the swishing to the hyper-proper, raises a variety of questions concerning the social production, political ideology, and cultural representation of non-conforming genders among men more generally. Although my interest here is largely centered on African American men's relation to sissy impersonation as conduct and character, it would be irresponsible not to investigate how the sissy appears under the aegis of dominant whiteness as well as under subordinating racial groups besides blackness. Part of my inquiry here concerns whether sissiness is manifested differently in different racial formations. I am not suggesting that there is no underlying commonality across race in the delineation of a sissy persona, only that such a delineation takes on different forms and consequences due to the peculiar circumstances adhering to the construction of black masculinity under white supremacy. In chapter 4, for instance, I examine the Cold War display of a white sissy like Truman Capote, in contrast with Baldwin's Sissy Insurgency, itself contrasted with the different expressions of sissy conduct of Little Richard in early rock and roll and Sylvester James in disco music. In chapter 6, I consider how the pro football player Esera Tualu references his Polynesian heritage as a defense against the tendency in the white West to equate homosexuality with sissiness, while Tualu uses his native marginalized culture to gesture towards a third gender, the Fa'afafine. He finds it difficult not to transliterate this word as sissy, thus defeating his own insistence on a cultural distinction that makes a significant gender difference. Here again, we run up against the limits of language to enrich rather than to straitjacket our perceptions of gender conduct. Nevertheless, Tualu communicates powerfully the idea that Fa'afafine is indigenous to Samoan culture, even as he remains entangled in the sissophobia that he says he learned from the Christian morality unfortunately imposed on his native culture by Euro-American imperialism. White sissies definitely represent a betrayal of the prerogatives granted not only to maleness but also to whiteness. Because white masculinity is the dominant norm for gender identity, white sissies must flaunt their open disregard for the undeniable privilege that white masculinity affords. Because black men are already at least once removed from the dominant norm, so to be a sissy is paradoxically both a heightened risk and a cultural resource. As we shall see, across history, black men have enacted both shamelessly and shamefacedly, and also avoided both affectionately and aggressively sissy identification. In chapter 5, for instance, we can understand the much referenced homophobia evident in black cultural nationalist discourse by examining not only these writers' sissophobia, but also their risk of seeing themselves as sissies exactly because of their sophisticated literacy. Amiri Baraka represents the perfect case of such, as his early fictional protagonist, Roy, seems modeled on James Baldwin's John Grimes, while also enacting a narrative of maturation that ambivalently seeks to pivot the achievement of manhood on sissy avoidance. In chapter 6, we see how black pro athletes narrate their own sportsmanship through an ambivalent relation to sissiness, at once distancing themselves from sissiness while conspicuously embracing the sissiness in others. Although sissiness is normatively that which is to be avoided at all costs, its presence and influence in African American and American culture are inescapable. The blossoming field of black masculinity studies has done much to complicate and enrich our understanding of exactly how race intersects with gender, often in confusing and contradictory ways. An especially helpful approach for this study has been Mark Anthony Neal's theorization of illegible black masculinities. Neal translates the problem of masculine identity formation into a question of legibility without losing the strong sense of what E. Patrick Johnson calls the material way of knowing. Neal clarifies how we are beset by a multiple bind in accounting for the twists and turns of masculinity's black face when he engages in a project aimed at rendering legible black male bodies, those bodies that are all too real to us, illegible, while simultaneously rendering so-called illegible black bodies, those black male bodies we can't believe are real, legible. Paradoxically, blackness tends to make masculinity both overly familiar, trapped in unforgiving and deadly stereotypes that have justified lynching, castration, after emancipation, and police murderousness, after the second emancipation of civil rights, and at the same time mysteriously alienated from conventional gender norms. Between the raping buck and the Uncle Tom eunuch, black manliness has suffered a pincer motion whereby white dominant culture refuses the in-between, despite centuries of black men who have modeled extra exemplary lives of unparalleled manhood integrity. When black men have, on rare occasion, been represented as sissies, it becomes something of a N-word joke, confirming how easily the black raping beast with the super engorged cock can flip into an Uncle Tom eunuch. Okay, deep stuff. Okay, I get what he's saying. I get it. When posed as a peril for respectable black manliness by African Americans themselves, the black sissy can become a racial embarrassment, much like Du Bois's take on Washington. Despite the long history of sissies, whether superciliously respectable or fiercely flagrant, who have achieved an oversized place within the pantheon of black history, from George Washington Carver to James Baldwin, from Little Richard to Dennis Rodman, and beyond. Okay, basically what he's trying to say here, from my understanding, is that, black masculinity has been, shaped by white dominant society, and twisted and contorted in such a way that two extremes sort of exist, right? Black men who are neutered in their sexuality and manliness, like an Uncle Tom type character, right? And then you have black men who exhibit, the grossest exaggerations of our masculinity that the white mind has created and put upon us, right? Like black men are known as, rapists, sexual beasts with extra large, gigantic penises and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I get what he's saying. And so when there have been black men that have exhibited, qualities that all men should aspire to, it's hard for others to accept those people as really being full-on black men, right? So anything that doesn't fit into those two paradigms, from my reading of here, is something that is called a sissy, right? And yeah, that's what I'm understanding here. All right, institutional sissiness is our next section, right? In addition to speculative inquiry with an emphasis on the material, discursive, ideological expressions of racial conduct and character, and on the social and psychic dimensions of liminality, this study also suggests that sissiness is crucial to the institutional operation of hegemonic masculinity. The institutions that regulate access to power depend on the prospect of sissy jeopardy to guard a proper masculinity, but this internal sissy threat may change in subtle ways according to historical and place-specific circumstance, including racial identity, in the same sense that masculinity is sustained through institutions, not merely through individuals who manifest and perform the masculine. So it could be said that sissification is an institutional phenomenon. Against the discursive practice of conceiving the sissy as an isolated figure whose rarity codifies his abnormality, sissiness historically has been vital to the sustenance of those key institutions: politics, religion, the military, and other policing forces, sports, academia, and the family, tasked with governing and protecting white patriarchal masculinity as the source and arbiter of power. The sissy serves as a bugbear scaring men toward proper masculine comportment through sissophobic mockery, panic, shaming, and violence. But the sissy's present absence is also an odd source of inspiration, demarcating the limits of institutional acceptability, even when the sissy lives at the heart of an institution. We can see the institutional function of the sissy at work in a range of venues studied here, from the government's large-scale purging of soft men during the Cold War to the intimate acts of sissy shaming portrayed in Baldwin's fictional Temple of the Fire Baptized, the Pentecostal church that his hero John Grimes attends in Go Tell It on the Mountain, where the systematic sissy aversion that pro sports like basketball and football inculcates in their athletes, to the mockery and dismissal that one of George Washington Carver's black male colleagues used to delegitimize his authority as head of academic agriculture at the Tuskegee Institute. Sometimes institutions seek to police sissiness in draconian ways, such as the Catholic boys' school that expels a postulate on suspicion aroused by his effeminate manner, as narrated in David Kopey's sports disclosure memoir. At other times, the institutional regulation of perceived sissiness can come in the guise of paternalistic encouragement, such as when Eddie Griffith's boss, in order to coax him into a boxing career, must discourage his interest in ladies' hats based on the assumption that a black boy with such natural musculature would otherwise be wasting his native potential. The institutional influence of the sissy is not always through negational acts like coaxing, ridicule, dismissal, shaming, or violence, however. As we see with Booker T. Washington's wooing of white industrial patronage, James Weldon Johnson's handling of a career in the U.S. Consular Service, Truman Capote's exploitation of emerging televisual media, and the 1990s straight black sissy memoirist's use of sissiness to desegregate elite universities. Sometimes a sissy demeanor can enable men to maneuver within institutions in which sensitivity, vulnerability, caution, and finesse are tolerated as long as those characteristics are subordinated to larger masculinist ends. Perhaps the most apt example of institutional sissiness, though, is that of the church sissy, whose particular soft talents are highly valued by an institution otherwise doctrinally intolerant of gender deviation. One could even go so far as to say that the church without its circumspect, self-censoring sissies would hardly be church at all. The sissy is a foundational institutional figure in that the most impactful agencies and organizations of white male power are structured to defend against his influence, much more his presence. The military embodies perhaps that institution whose regulation of hegemonic masculinity has been most uniform and forceful. Indeed, soldiering figures the sissy as its absolute contrary, the soft man, the yellow-bellied coward, the undisciplined soldier who flees the battlefield. The exclusion from and then segregation of African American men in military service in the United States provides an enlightening instance of how racialized sissiness anchors the institutional masculinity of soldiering. From the War for Independence onwards, black men have historically been denied combat aptitude as men not quite self-disciplined enough for warfare. Black men have had to prove again and again with each national war that they are battle-worthy, especially that they are worthy of military command. As W.E.B. Du Bois remarks, at the outset of the Civil War, both Northerners and Southerners assumed that slaves would not fight for their freedom. Negroes, on the whole, were considered cowards, he writes, and inferior beings whose very presence in America was unfortunate. For African American men and later women and gay men, eager to defeat the long-held assumption that black men would lack the courage to fight on their own behalf for freedom, military service has been one of the central ways to lay claim to those prerogatives of citizenship historically invested in white heterosexual masculinity. Booker T. Washington makes this point when he equates the battlefield valor of black soldiers during the Civil War with fitness for freedom. The services of the Negro troops performed in the Civil War in fighting for the freedom of their race not only convinced the officers who commanded them and the white soldiers who fought by their side that the Negro race deserved to be free, but it served to convince the great mass of the people in the North that the Negroes were fit for freedom. Because of this intimate link among manliness, citizenship, and brave soldiering, African American leaders were especially upset by Theodore Roosevelt's insinuation in the Rough Riders and elsewhere that black troops showed a lack of nerve during the Cuban invasion of the Spanish-American War. As Christopher B. Booker documents, Roosevelt at first praised privately and publicly the black troops that fought under him, but after returning to the United States and immersing himself in the realities of political life, he began to downplay the performance of the black regiments and ultimately challenged their bravery and loyalty, finding it not only ideologically convenient, but also politically necessary. Who would have thought Roosevelt was a racist too? Yet while encouraging an aggressive and venturesome masculinity for American whites, Booker writes, Roosevelt's message for black males was quite the opposite. It was a message heavily influenced by the realpolitik of the era, which dictated that black males be kept at arm's length, even if they formed an important block of voters who consistently voted for the Republican Party. In his attack on the manliness of black soldiers, Roosevelt repeats a common notion, that a colored man is not mentally, emotionally capable of comprehending good military discipline without the element of personal loyalty to a white superior. Interesting. Okay. All right. because the military, along with sport, is the most prominent institution where masculinity has been tested along explicit racial lines, sissification plays a highly visible role in determining who is fit for service and even more who is fit for the command, based in racial claims of a natural hierarchy of gender within the masculine. For example, in John Richard's essay, Some Experiences with Colored Soldiers, originally published in the Atlantic Monthly in August 1919, we find a crystallized articulation of the sissification of the black soldier as a reaffirmation of white men's right to command. As with Roosevelt, the insult to the black soldier focuses on the notion of a loss of nerve on the battlefield. Needless to say, this stereotype merely mimes the one rehearsed by the performance of blackface minstrelsy, the plantation school of literature, and the Zip Coon figure in vaudeville so popular across the slave and Jim Crow eras. The idea that the slave métier is subservient loyalty to the master and his brood. But his weakness is a superstitious fear of haunts and a lack of moral compass. Richards explicitly alludes to the figure of the loyal slave when he tries to explain why it is not sufficient for black soldiers to have solely black officers. I have said nothing about colored officers because I have not known them, but this much I think is true. Black still turns naturally to white for leadership, just as on the southern plantation the slave turned questioning eyes to the planter. This is why for Richards, the colored soldier's only valuable attribute is obedience, absolute happiness in obeying white officers. He paints this scene to punctuate the assertion, no troops will do well under a slipshod drill master, but the colored man will deteriorate and become slack more quickly than the white. He responds immediately, however, to snappy commands and a soldierly appearance. This curtailed sense of the black man's capacity for soldiering is captured graphically in the image of the poorly commanded colored soldier's tendency to become slack. A soldier at attention is the opposite of slack. A physical alertness visually cued as an upright body, spine stiffened, arms stiffly gripping the weapon, head facing forward, eyes eagle-focused ahead, mouth neither grinning nor grimacing. On the battlefield, the metaphor of slackness images a failure of regimentation, discipline, and obedience to command. That's interesting. I've heard these stories before that, black men were not considered to be brave on the battlefield, but I never equated that with sissiness or some type of masculinity that was... I've always equated that with them just thinking black people were less intelligent, black people had no way of comprehending the stakes of war or what this war is about. So I always thought of it that way, but this is a very interesting take on it, that the way they spoke about black soldiers in racist terms for much of U.S. history is really couched in sissiphobia rather than it is in negrophobia. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Okay. We can see how the melange of Slavish stereotypes promoted to insult black soldiering, when they are not focused on the hyperphallic raping predator, congregate around the image of black men's constitutional unfitness for virile manhood. Given the prevailing racial attitudes of whites in the years before and during the war, and given that slavery had only ceased to exist some 50 years earlier, Neil A. Wynne writes of World War I, it is not remarkable that so little change should occur during the war. Even sympathetic whites tended to speak of Afro-Americans in the stereotyped terms of uncle, Hottentot, pickaninny, and as boys who do not grow up even under shell fire. Cowardice is emphasized in these performances of Jim Crow maleness exactly because the coward is taken to be the contrary of proper white masculinity. This sissification of black men's military prowess helps to explain why white officers and enlisted men, like Richards himself, have damned with faint praise the achievements of black military men. To acknowledge without reservation the bravery of black soldiers would be to threaten white supremacy as institutionally executed through soldiering as the standard bearer of masculinity's paramount virtue, courage under fire. Okay, interesting stuff. So basically, institutions like the military affirm white male patriarchy. And by excluding black men a lot of the times, or for a large part of American history from the military, it was a way of denying black men manlyhood, right? If you look at manlyhood as being a soldier, if that's a way of seeing things. So there is no more vivid an image of this deliberate sissification of the black male soldier than that provided by veteran Frederick Williams, whose testimony is recorded in William Miles's documentary Men of Bronze, 1977, on the experience of black military men in World War I. Based on Williams's oral narrative in the film, Phyllis R. Klotzman reports, at home the men had to train ignominiously with broomsticks. They weren't allowed guns. At home and abroad, they were met with hostility from their own countrymen and were confined to the role of stevedores, labor troops, until they were finally assigned to the 4th French Army. The boy or man armed with a broom or mop often signals a sissy disposition, as we'll see in the cases of Booker T. Washington, James Baldwin, and Robert Steptoe. The humiliation of black soldiers training with brooms is intended at once to suggest that a black man with a gun would be a threat to whites, either because of incompetence or indiscipline, while paradoxically also suggesting that he is not man enough for real battles as a real soldier. Even Washington, who eagerly imagined himself in 1901 as wielding a broom to gain entry into Hampton Institute, as we shall see in the next chapter, was upset by the routine typecasting of black soldiers as sissy cowards unfit for duty. The figure of the brave soldier operates beyond the military institution as a guarantor of the courageous virtue of manhood. And for black masculinity, the military soldier has historically been conjoined by black authors and activists to justify the masculine bravado of the race man who fights on behalf of civil rights and black liberation. In one of his most famous crisis opinion pieces, Returning Soldiers, published on May 1919, W.E.B. Du Bois urges the soldiers coming back from World War I to return fighting. But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses. If not that war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our land. We return fighting. Rather than merely a tired metaphor, fighting for rights by other than military means, synecdochically referenced as brains and brawn, extends the battle to the fatherland that oppresses them. Du Bois participates in a long historical discourse equating manly military valor with civil rights activism, exploited by speakers from across the political spectrum, including that of black Civil War veterans. Washington's controversial speech at the Spanish-American War Victory Parade in Chicago in 1898, discussed in Chapter 2, the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper Double V campaign during World War II, and the Black Power activists of the 1960s, discussed in Chapter 4 and 5. According to the logic of this discourse, as so eloquently expressed by Du Bois, to fail to bring the discipline and courage learned as a soldier into the home front battle is to be no less a coward and a jackass than a soldier who flees the battlefield under fire. It may not be surprising that the military has historically been a key institution whose very mission is dictated by separating the men from the sissies through a racial logic that projected black men as inordinately sissified in their natural propensity for cowardice. But the same can be said of activism as an institution defined by opposition to the status quo. The struggle over racial justice in the United States has long been analogized to a war, with race leaders imagined as warriors, a logic that reaches an apex during the Black Power era, where Black Panthers modeled themselves on an insurgent military unit. Black nationalists evoked imagery of the battlefield, and nonviolent protesters were mocked for refusing to fight like men and for putting women and children on the front lines. In Dynamite Growing Out of Their Skulls, Calvin C. Hernton cryptically captures this metaphor, equating racial struggle with warfare, and highlights the common idea that the men who advocate nonviolence must be queer. The philosophy that compels any man to lie down before his enemies when he knows they are going to tread on his flesh, the flesh with which he makes love to his woman, seems rather queer to me. That's a bar. Many black nationalists extend the logic that equates the passive in passive resistance to the passivity of the penetrated F word. So much so that Martin Luther King Jr. is compelled to defend nonviolence by insisting that it is not passive at all. In direct response to Malcolm X, King demands that the strategy be more accurately called nonviolent direct action rather than passive resistance. For as long as even the hardiest resistance remains passive, it is in danger of being perceived as sissified conduct rather than manly valor. King goes further to assert the manliness of moral force as an advance over physical violence. Hold on. Woo. Oh, I gotta sneeze. All right, held that back in. All right. Acceptance of nonviolent direct action was a proof of a certain sophistication on the part of the Negro masses, for it showed that they dared to break with the old, ingrained concepts of our society. The eye for an eye philosophy, the impulse to defend oneself when attacked, has always been held as the highest measure of American manhood. We are a nation that worships the frontier tradition, and our heroes are those who champion justice through violent retaliation against injustice. It is not simple to adopt the credo that moral force has as much strength and virtue as the capacity to return a physical blow, or that to refrain from hitting back requires more will and bravery than the automatic reflexes of defense. Against his nonviolent ethos, King goes on to structure the strategy through the lingo of warfare, soldiering, and military rank, trying to turn an increasingly troubling public image of unfit masculinity into one of fitness for nonviolent battle. To join an army that trains its adherents in the methods of violence, you must be of a certain age. But in Birmingham, some of the most valued foot soldiers were youngsters ranging from elementary pupils to teenage high school and college students. For acceptance in the armies that maim and kill, one must be physically sound, possessed of straight limbs and accurate vision. But in Birmingham, the lame and the halt and the crippled could and did join up. Against the charge that women and children were replacing men on the front line, King tries to retain the substance of manly courage and soldierly discipline while arguing for nonviolence as inclusive for all people of all ages, genders, and the differently abled. He continues with this entangled analogy for several paragraphs, writing, "In Birmingham, outside of the few generals and lieutenants who necessarily directed and coordinated operations, the regiments of the demonstrators marched in democratic phalanx." Could you bring a bandana, please? Marched in democratic phalanx. King's dilemma and his rhetorical response to it indicate how difficult it is to shift the epistemology of political activism and social revolution away from those dictated by a masculinist ideology. Thank you. All right. Even though King comported himself with apparent ease as a properly gendered heterosexual, his political and moral stance subjected him to sissy suspicion, no less damaging than the attacks on Washington 60 years earlier. As we shall see in Chapter 4, Baldwin meets a similar challenge by coyly embracing his homo-sissiness to proffer a more thorough critique of white male supremacy's masculinist mechanics. This is very interesting. I've never thought of it this way. Once again, I'm not discounting this writer's interpretations or experiences or his thought that he's put into, because it is well thought out. It is a well thought out argument that essentially, Martin Luther King's, nonviolent resistance, passive resistance to segregation and apartheid in America, etc., right, was critiqued as a type of sissiness. It's not manly, it's not masculine to just let your oppressors, whoop on you, beat on you, hose you down, and to march with women and children into essentially a battle against the police and against a racist state. And so Martin Luther King, in a certain type of way, tries to reaffirm his masculinity by saying we are not doing passive resistance. We are doing a type of nonviolent direct action. And we are soldiers going into a battlefield. So it's a very interesting way of looking at it. I never thought about it that way, of looking at Martin Luther King's rhetoric as a type of reaffirmation of masculinity and blackness, or critiques of it being done as a type of sissiphobia. All right. The military as a supreme institution of masculine command and the soldier as a supreme exemplar of masculine discipline loom large in the black male quest for masculine respectability. For the military and the militant, the sissy looms as large as a cautionary figure. The difficulty of the conduct of a soldier is that, while being expected to possess the most aggressive masculinity, even to the point of mass killing and daring self-sacrifice, he is also expected to possess characteristics usually projected onto a too-good sissy boy: obedience, loyalty, fastidiousness in dress and grooming, and guarded intimacy with other men that staves off sexual attraction. The sissy is not just a haunting within the good soldier, he is also a haunting within the institution of military discipline. Rather than devoting a single chapter to the sissy in relation to the military institution, I have thematized this matter across the chapters of this study. Thus, we see African American men respond to assumptions about their soldierly unfitness, whether as exclusion or servility, as a sign of their manhood deficiency across the 20th century from varying ideological, geographic, and socioeconomic perspectives. We see how Booker T. Washington adapts his hygienic persona in response to his mentor, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who exploits white military command as a rationale for the kind of servile racial discipline he organizes to control the black students at Hampton Institute. We see James Weldon Johnson narrating his sophisticated negotiation of white military officers in the face of a lynching military mob in his hometown and during Civil War when he is in the consular service in Central America. We see how black nationalists attempt to image themselves as armed warriors against the foil of civil rights leaders as cowardly sissies who would rather prostitute themselves to white men's power than man the front line for black liberation. We see how gay soldiers and professional athletes turn to racial desegregation of the military and sports as a model for their own fight to serve openly on actual battlefields as well as on the metaphorical battlefields of sport. The enactment of institutional masculinity by sissifying black men to exclude or subordinate them from command in these organizations operates beyond the military establishment in such rigorously guarded venues of power as politics, religion, science, and sport. Ironically, the very attempt to purge the sissy from such institutions causes him to haunt the national imaginings of a manhood crippled by perceptions of effeminacy, weakness, cowardice, and unspecified softness. In some ways, the sissy's institutional effect is all the more powerful in his fleshy absence from the corridors of power, because that absence is never an accomplished fact, always a palpable threat to be warned off and fought against. Like a ghost without history or portfolio, the sissy seems to appear mysteriously out of nowhere and out of recorded time. The idea of the sissy as a socio-psychological phenomenon is appropriately shrouded in linguistic and historical obscurity. Examining the etymology of the word can get us only so far, but it is at least a place to start. We must keep in mind, however, that the U.S. gendered nonconformity is so entangled with racial assassination that a proper reckoning with the sissy figure can be accounted for only through a concomitant racial analysis. Although etymology cannot deliver to us the material granularity of the sissy experience, it can help us historicize and contextualize the changing semantics of the discourses related to the complex of behaviors and temperaments associated with the phenomenon of male gender nonconformity. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term sissy, as used in reference to a male, is first recorded in 1887, derived from cis, the shortened form of sister, and was used to designate an effeminate man. Thinking of the root from sister to cis to sissy reconfirms the gender, rather than sexual connotation of the word. Like other terms popular during the period, pansy immediately comes to mind. It might be revealing that the term emerges in English vernacular at the same time as the development of sexology, which seeks to devise non-judgmental scientific terms like invert and homosexual to describe men who are sexually attracted to men. If cis is an endearing diminutive of sister, was sissy originally used among queer men as a form of destigmatizing address, as girl, Mary, Miss Ann, and even bitch were used among pre-Stonewall homosexual men and still among some gay men today? Or was cis used by others to stigmatize men who were perceived as incompetently masculine? As we shall see in Chapter 3, it is likely that the term swish, whose provenance emerges in the early decades of the 20th century, was first used by queer men among themselves, and the same could be true of sissy. So once again, the gay people, trans people, always invent culture and swag. If it doesn't come from black folks, it comes from queer folks and trans folks. Anything cool in culture comes from queer folks, trans folks, black folks in general. I mean, we should just learn this. It just should be tattooed on our foreheads. I want to emphasize again how the extreme gender binary of masculine, feminine in English and other European languages tends to refuse any gray area between male as fully masculine and female as fully feminine. Therefore, to be less than masculine is immediately to be projected as effeminate. The prefix F before feminine indicates the difference between normative femininity and the non-normative feminine when exhibited by a person of the wrong male sex. Nonetheless, being feminine is not the same as being effeminate, insofar as the former dictates an appropriate behavior performed by females, whereas the latter indicates discordance between the person's gender conduct and presumed sexual anatomy, whether as biopsychological behavior, naturalized bodily comportment, or social temperament and moral character. The prefix F means away from or outward, which could indicate the discordance between femininity and its expression in a male. Its effect is to intensify the root word it qualifies, such that effeminacy is always an exaggerated or panicked form of the feminine exactly because of its expression in or on a person perceived as male. The F prefix exclaims, heightens, distorts, and alarms both the person whose body or personality exhibits it, and the feminine itself as an idealized contrary of not only masculinity, but also maleness. The binary extremism carried by the language, in the case the vernacular, disallows gender intermediation, whereby the sissy could be conceived as a conduct, conduit, condition, or identity existing somewhere between masculinity and femininity, if not as an entity or activity within masculinity itself. Because the masculine is a top term in an extreme vertical binary, however, just as white and black coexist in an extreme racial binary, any declension from the masculine necessarily falls into its contrary, a version of the feminine. As Peter Stallybrass and Alan White have explained in relation to the grotesque as a social category, such binary extremism in discourse always reverts as proof to the body itself. In this case, the actual person of the sissy serving as the somatic proof of the gender anomaly referenced in the vague term sissy. Because of the hierarchical nature of extreme binarism, the term masculine is not commensurate with the bottom term feminine, nor is declension from masculinity in a man commensurate with the variance from conventional femininity in a woman. For a woman to transgress conventional femininity certainly holds dire dangers, but there are not exactly the same dangers visited upon a male who transgresses hegemonic masculinity. This is why there is no exact corollary of sissy to indicate a woman who is incompetently feminine, though tomboy perhaps comes closest. Tomboy has some positive connotations, though as it describes a girl who is unusually adventurous, and it also tends to be age-specific, indicating a girl who has not yet outgrown her boyishness, whereas sissy can be used for a male of any age. In other words, the opprobrium that routinely applies to a sissy boy only begins to take effect for a boyish girl when she is perceived as having prolonged this behavior beyond tolerance. Even so, tomboy applied to a woman does not have the sting of sissy applied to a man, for it is a far greater crime for a man to betray his prerogative of manliness than for a woman to aspire to masculinity. Indeed, given that masculinity carries a higher value, it is seen as somewhat understandable, if not acceptable, that a woman would want to abandon femininity to be more like a man. It is also revealing how such terms of gender transgression are not fully fixed across time and place. An epithet can even migrate from describing a gender anomalous male to ascribing a gender anomalous female. For instance, the other common vernacular term for gender dissonant female, butch, was originally used for a tough street boy in the first decade of the 20th century, but by the mid-century had come to be applied to the conduct of a masculine woman, especially as paired in a lesbian dyad with a feminine one. In today's gay vernacular, butch has migrated back to a descriptor of male conduct, but as it relates to homosexual dyad between a conventionally masculine man and his femme romantic partner, ironically terms coined in an earlier era to describe the female invert and a conventionally feminine female partner now are used to reference a similar pairing between two queer men. Whereas the terms for gender dissonant women are comparatively rare, Sissy belongs to a continuum of vernacular terms for various degrees and modes of masculine incompetence. Pansy, Nancy, Nance, Nelly, Fan, Flamer, Flame, Mama's Boy, Crybaby, Namby-Pamby, Mollycoddle. Okay, he's listed them out here. Haven't heard some of these. Mollycoddle, Panty Waist, Lightweight, Lily Liver, Softy, Girly Boy, Poofter, Poof, Puff, Wimp, Wuss, Pussy, Cunt, Punk, Swisher, Swish, Fairy, Femme, Queen, Queer, Bitch, Cocksucker, the F word 2 times, Homo. Other terms like being light in the loafers or in black vernacular, having sugar in the blood, indicate how such opprobrium tends to spin out into colorful metaphor, as though mere single-term epithets are not enough to gauge the abnormality. These are statements not just about the observable bodily comportment or suspect social behavior, but also and more disdainfully about intrinsic moral character. The plethora of such terms indicates the deep, free-floating level of anxiety, indeed panic, occasioned by the prospect of failed manliness, whether temporary, as in a moment of cowardice under duress, or seemingly intrinsic or essential, as in a man who cannot achieve or perform masculinity under any circumstance. It is especially instructive how even a term like punk, which in U.S. slang originally denoted a tough street boy, can be flipped into failed masculinity, as it is used more recently to stigmatize a male who is available to be penetrated, emotionally or physically, a boyish man who, though probably straight, has been forced into a passive sexual position with another man. As I emphasized throughout this study, while insecurity, which breeds panic, is cast outside hegemonic masculinity as evidence of a sissy temperament, this constitutes a projection or deflection of an affect that is intrinsic to masculinity itself. To be masculine is to worry about whether one is ever masculine enough, but to shield such worry by projecting it onto the soft other. The sissy, instead, introjects this worry, as discussed above, as a hypersensitive awareness of the fungibility of the line that is supposed to separate virile masculinity from its contrary. The insecurity at the heart of masculinity can unmoor even the most conventional signals of masculine competence, such as the Castro Street clones of the 1970s took the posture, demeanor, and vestments of working-class manliness and turned them into emblems of militantly gay masculinity. I think that's like the guys who did YMCA. What is it? The Village People? Okay. So, there is a correlation between a lack of manliness, penetrability, weakness, timidity, demureness, softness, cowardice, the presumption of effeminateness, and the plausibility of same-gender attraction. As a measure of virility, the sissy is someone who is too penetrable emotionally and or physically, and thus occupies the false status of a female, one who is naturally penetrated, and by extension a homosexual, one who is unnaturally penetrated. In the face of these correlatives, however, I want to consider how the sissy tiptoes on the line ostensibly separating the failed male from the natural female, as well as the line isolating the failed male from the homosexual. Correlations are not here equations, but are instead approximations with a difference. A failed male always has the capacity for masculine recuperation, for instance, through an act of courage, because he, after all, possesses the requisite anatomy to claim such virility. It is less certain whether the homosexual similarly has a potential for sexual readjustment, especially after sexual orientation becomes more a matter of physiological etiology and fixed social identity in the decades following the establishment of Freudian psychoanalysis and sexology. Unless he identifies as female or undergoes gender reassignment surgery, in which case she is no longer a sissy. The alarm attending the sissy epithet derives exactly from the fact that he is male, one who is not conducting himself as such, not just a gender failure of social categorization, but also a categorical moral flaw, if not a heinous sin. It is exactly in the space of gender differentiation within masculinity, the panic that necessarily attends the prerogative of the masculine, that sissy impersonation operates. If the sissy could be firmly ousted from maleness, there would be no reason for panic. Because he is perceived as anatomically male but socially not conforming to the strict idealizations of the masculine, he embodies a deficiency inside maleness and thus within the masculine, a liminal or subliminal boundary marking the masculine as such. The sissy epithet encodes gender alarm, then exactly because, while sissy behavior, temperament, and physicality seem readily legible as failed masculinity, it is impossible to mark that line where a male becomes irretrievably sissified. Applying Mark Anthony Neal's theory of legibility to Rod Ferguson's observation about the diverse expressions of sissy conduct and the character among African Americans in the late 20th century South, we can understand how a large portion of the panic over sissiness results from the fungibility of the term itself, as well as to the fungibility of the kinds of conduct character represented. Some sissies are so subtle in their behavior and temperament that they can pass for straight. Some boys and men can code switch at the drop of a dime, shifting from a high effeminate manner to a butch posture based on a perceived threat or an implied demand for gender conformity in a particular situation. In other words, sissy impersonation is not always self-consistent, a fact that heightens alarm over sissy identity to the point of intensifying the social demand for the sissy to be made legible. That some men can perform conventional masculinity, however, should not be mistaken as merely an act put on for an audience, as we know from gender theories of performativity discussed earlier. Accounting for this fungibility within and across gender is where the theory of performativity is especially helpful. To observe sissy behavior as a kind of gender code switching emphasizes the extent to which such conduct is unavoidable, that even in the face of punitive violence, they cannot seem to change their manner. As a complement to performativity, as much as a corrective, I deploy the concept of conduct here to emphasize that dynamic in which the enactment of sissiness operates somewhere between an habituated gender performance and an inhabited gender identity. At the slightest hint of an improper gesture, intonation, voice, or affect, a male is immediately labeled and targeted, a zero-toleration policy of sissophobic enforcement. One could even go so far as to suggest that U.S. culture is more comfortable with easily identifiable sissy boys, who can be verbally mocked and physically violated to ensure their distance from the genuinely masculine, than it is with those boys and men who skirt the line more discreetly, not quite manly enough, a bit too proper, or a bit too gentle. Just as during the Cold War, the government and press saw soft menaces everywhere in the corridors of power and fomented policies to purge any male person who raised the slightest suspicion of homosexuality, equated with sissy legibility. So society more generally has taken some comfort in a physical display of presumed sissiness, preferring the obvious threat to the insidiously invisible one. Likewise, differentiating between the sissy and the homosexual, however subtle, sometimes even indecipherable, as in the panicked reaction of a morally outraged straight man to the appearance of a homo sissy, occasions a theoretical opening for our inquiry. The man who is physically penetrated by or desires to penetrate another male lacks a certain deniability or at least ambiguity, an ambiguity that characterizes the sissy as a male who has failed to be manly enough but has not yet crossed the line, as far as we know, into the non-masculine space reserved for the penetrated homosexual. As will be explored across these chapters, because the sissy is perceived as gender aberrant, he becomes the vestibule of homosexuality, a liminal site that portends a same-gender sexual orientation and, in extremis, a desire to be anally penetrated, even when there is no hard evidence, so to speak, of such conduct. Thus, unlike with the cross-dresser, homosexual, or trans person, sissy conduct becomes primarily a matter of gossip, innuendo, and speculation, rather than a matter of law, policy, doctrine, or theology. Also, as a result, sissies, unlike homosexuals and trans persons, have not thus far organized an effective, discrete social identity. In the postscript, I ponder this queer possibility in the age of gender fluidity. What would it mean for sissy boys and sissified men to organize not in a benevolent cause for the softer gender, such as gentlemen for gender justice, but instead for the equal rights and social prerogatives of their own soft selves? Interesting. If there is any doubt that the cause of gender fluidity will be a long, hard battle, the postscript suggests we need only remember the rise of Donald J. Trump and his blunt celebration of male sexual predation, bullying against those perceived as weak, and white supremacist militias like the Proud Boys. And if we ever doubted that a line still separates white hegemonic masculinity from even the most virile of black manliness, we need only consider how Trump has repeatedly pitted himself against black male professional athletes who support racial justice movements, whether Colin Kaepernick or LeBron James. At least in the embattled gender-racial moment when this book was being written, the fissures between a retrograde white heteronormativity and progressive black manhood could not be more at odds. Very good point about Trump right there. I like that point. So the question arises as to how race complicates the sissy's liminality within masculinity and between normative, or white, manliness and passive homosexuality. Are there particular connotations to the usage of the term sissy among African Americans and other racialized social groups? Just as the vocabulary defining male nonconforming gender changes, at least around the edges, with time and place, so racial and color distinctions transform and migrate. Although white and black sissies are correlatives, cousins under the skin, so to speak, there is a distinction that emerges from the conditions that adhere to black masculinity as a gender formation conceptualized as proximate, if not inimical, to white masculinity as the dominant norm. Black masculinity might be theorized as a subdominant norm, prevailing within blackness however tenuously, but oppressed and marginalized by a white male supremacy. We can take this inquiry further by asking whether or not how color shapes the person and perceptions of sissiness. Is a light-skinned sissy perceived in the same way as a dark-skinned one? Given the impact of color on the management of black masculinity by white society as well as through black culture, I would think not. Dark and lighter-skinned men have different relations to masculinity, exactly because whiteness arbitrates the masculine ideal, and thus the shade of blackness must also predicate different relations to failed or liminal manliness. During early Jim Crow, for instance, dark-skinned men were seen as closer to the slave inheritance and thus closer to African savagery, burdened within the stigma of either African savagery and thus an aberrantly wild masculinity or slavish unmanliness, bereft of manly character and all claims to manhood, rights as defined by white institutions. The dark-skinned male betokened the extremes against which white males defined racial and gender supremacy. This is why James Weldon Johnson's fall autobiography of the ex-colored man is so instructive for understanding how color colors manliness under Jim Crow. often the offspring of the slave master. The mulatto, along with his light-skinned relatives, was given greater proximity to white masculinity, though never allowed unfettered access to it. But skin color in men has been a fluctuating gauge of masculine character. In 1960s black nationalism, dark-skinned men were especially prized, at least symbolically, as preserving an African manhood otherwise diminished and contaminated in lighter-skinned men, whose legacy was defiled by the history of white men's rape of slave women. Lighter-skinned men at the head of the Black Power revolution often expressed self-conscious anxiety about their lack of melanin and sometimes projected this guilt onto black women for having had intercourse with the slave holders in the long racial past. As we saw with Wright's depiction of Shorty, there is also an idea that lighter-skinned men are punks, a word with particular resonance in black vernacular, meaning both unmasculine and cowardly, and that this lack of manliness is constantly threatening to lure them into passive or penetrable homosexuality. In recent lingo spreading in televisual and social media, pretty boys has become an expression that is used especially to designate light-skinned men whose preppy grooming and attire counter the popularity of thug fashion under the masculine hardness of hip-hop culture. Pretty boys are not necessarily sissies or gay, but there is an implicit sense that such boys are too aesthetically pleasing to be full-fledged manly men, and thus given the high visibility of gay men in the current political climate, one can never know for sure. One of the prominent figures providing a fluctuating template for the interconnection of race, color, and masculine fitness in U.S. culture was constructed by a white northern woman in the 1850s, Uncle Tom, the eponymous character of Harriet Beecher Stowe's blockbuster novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. In Stowe's hands, Uncle Tom exemplifies noble manly conduct through Christian martyrdom. As a dark-skinned slave, his very body contravenes all that is egregious in the white aristocracy of the slave-holding South, and everything that is complicit among northern white men too corrupt or cowardly to root out the unchristian evil of slavery. For Stowe, Uncle Tom's upright manliness is not surprisingly represented as a Christ-like gentleness, sensitivity, fidelity, simplicity, and self-sacrifice, anchoring values of the domestic sensibility undergirding Stowe's abolitionist ethos. Stowe seeks to transfer the slave's docile servility into a black man's exemplary Christian service. Aware of the strangeness of making a dark-skinned male slave the hero of our story, she highlights his African features from the outset. At this table was seated Uncle Tom, Mr. Shelby's best hand, who, as he is to be hero of our story, we must daguerreotype for our readers. He was a large, broad-chested, powerfully made man of a full, glossy black and a face whose truly African features were characterized by an expression of grave and steady good sense, united with much kindliness and benevolence. There was something about his whole air, self-respecting and dignified, yet united with a confiding and humble simplicity. Uncle Tom's glossy blackness and African phenotypes are intrinsic to his physicality, large, broad-chested, powerfully made, but it is hard to say whether this big black manliness produces or contrasts with the soft moral character he exudes, grave and steady, good sense, kindliness, benevolence, self-respect and dignity, and humble simplicity. It is Uncle Tom's Christ-like sensitivity that ultimately seals his fate when he righteously refuses to whip another slave, and later when he refuses to reveal to the evil slave master, Simon Legree, the route that escaped female slaves have taken. If the dark-skinned Uncle Tom could embody the high ground of manly Christian martyrdom in Stowe's Victorian moral system of gentle domestic self-sacrifice, his iconography was bound to shift radically as it migrated into African American culture. Despite Tom's resistance to Simon Legree, he immediately becomes an icon of unmanly race betrayal for African Americans, the worst epithet that can be unuttered against a black man by another black person. I can think of some other ones. Even though Booker T. Washington is more frequently aligned with Uncle Tom than not, Addison Gale Jr. makes use of this black vernacular view of Uncle Tom when explaining the new Negro ushered in by Washington. The new Negro, therefore, is no Uncle Tom, no cowering, pitying, tender-hearted old slave. What Stowe composes as civilizing Christian virtues of many self sacrifice, fidelity, and sensitivity are transposed as unmanly attributes of subservience and cowardice in Gale's discourse. Although Stowe's dagger type for a gentle Christ-like male slave was necessarily a big, glossy black African man, this did not reflect the social reality of her time. Lighter skinned men, often mulattoes like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, were perceived as more civilized, more akin to white manliness, and thus more fit to serve as leaders and intermediaries between black and white. As Richardson points out in his speeches, Malcolm X casts the Uncle Tom as homosexual or as bisexual when he depicts the slave as having a ravenous desire for white women, as part of Malcolm's strategy for questioning and attacking the manlyhood and masculinity of the prevailing civil rights leadership. By the 1960s, such civilizing light-skinned leaders are vigorously attacked as Uncle Toms, even when, as in the case of light-skinned Ralph Bunche, the first African-American to win the Nobel Peace Prize, he is considered heroic among the white American elite. All right, I don't know who highlighted this. I have a suspicion it was DoorOfEl. I don't know what the comment says here. Okay, it's just a re-quoting of the comments. I don't know what it says here. I can't scroll down. I don't know if DoorOfEl highlighted this or not, but I'm pretty sure whatever is highlighted is going to be taken out of context to promote some homophobic idea. But I'll read it here. As Mark Anthony Neal has noted concerning early 20th century movements to provide positive and strong constructions of black masculinity that would directly counter images of the shuffling sambo or blackface caricatures of black men by white minstrel performers, these caricatures still operate as shorthand epithets used by black men against other black men in an attempt to keep them in line with idealized images of the strong black man. Even today, Neal observes, words like sambo and minstrel are used by the talented 10th to describe hip-hop. Neal could add Tom as perhaps the most aggressive epithet, which, like the others, carries complex connotations of colorism and classism, and also packs insults driven by heterosexism, homophobia, and sissyphobia. By the mid-20th century, the Uncle Tom has become so anathema to black manhood aspirations that he becomes the contrary of virile, warring masculinity, often embodied in the historical figure of Nat Turner. So much so that when in a 1967 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, William Styron fictionalizes Nat Turner's story as a self-conflicting black man who is having sexual relations with both a white woman and a black man. Prominent black writers come to the defense of Turner's manhood in a volume devoted to that sense. When James Baldwin defends Styron as the basis of artistic freedom, he catalyzes the black nationalist suspicion of him as a sissy traitor who prefers intercourse with white men over a united front with his battle-ready black brothers. Just checking here. All right, so we're going to read to the end of this section and finish this part in our next reading. Arenas of masculine competence is where we'll wrap up. So although generally associated with penetrability, weakness, passivity, softness, cowardice, the sissy is not always merely weak, soft, passive, or cowardly. A cultural historical fact that is most prominently articulated in African American discourse and tradition, where sissies are sometimes imaged as street smart, hard-assed, and knife crazy. In fact, there is a long history of the fierce sissy, one who flaunts his gender anomaly to the point of being a swisher or swish. Like less ostentatiously, the black sissy can achieve a certain kind of respectability as a leader of the race, a gender balancing act that hinges on repressive self-restraint and most tellingly puts some distance between sissy demeanor, too soft, too nurturing, or too sophisticated, and passive homosexual conduct, as most visibly embodied in African American culture through the church sissy. The too-good boy can turn his obedient academic performance and often churchified conduct into professional prowess on behalf of the race, thus flipping a masculine deficit into a racial obligation, making sissy responsibility making sissy responsibility something to be tentatively admired within the race. There is a lineage of such sissy leaders: Washington, Carver, Johnson, Elaine Locke, Langston Hughes, Owen Dotson, James Baldwin, and Bayard Rustin, representing different manifestations of this phenomenon, and each indicating how sissiness fluctuates as a measure of virility or its deficiency, as well as a measure of same sexuality and its absence. All right, so we'll wrap up here. We'll read this next section, which I think will finish off chapter 1. And this was an interesting read. There's a lot to glean from this book, a lot to meditate on. Hard to really articulate all of my thoughts and feelings on this text in just a few sentences, but I really found this captivating and moving. So we're going to continue reading this tomorrow on our live stream, so tune in for that for part 4 of this very long book. And let me know if you have any other books you think I should read. Put it in the comment section, send me an email, and holla at me. Y'all be easy out there.